What if I told you doctors once removed your ribs to cure your lungs? That patients with tuberculosis were forced to sleep outdoors in winter, believing the cold air could heal them? Or that before antibiotics, people were treated with mercury, arsenic, and raw animal blood because there was no other hope? This isn't ancient history. It was the reality just 100 years ago. And in some places, the fight still isn't over. Curing the uncurable, the shocking history of tuberculosis treatments. Tuberculosis, also known as TB, a disease that's haunted humans for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptian mummies show signs of it. Poets, kings, and commoners died from it. But by the 1800s, it had become something else, a slow, wasting death sentence. They called it consumption because it consumed you from the inside out. It starts with a cough, then weight loss, fever, night sweats, blood in your lungs. Your body begins to vanish until there's nothing left to fight with. It didn't care how rich you were. It spread through the air. Just one cough, one shared breath, and you could be infected. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in Europe and America. 1 in every 7 people died from it. But here's the cruel part. Doctors had no cure, no antibiotics, no real defense. So they turned to the unimaginable. It was like COVID-19, but worse. No ICU beds, no oxygen tanks, no ventilators, no antibiotics, not even a way to test if you had it. You just started coughing, then wasting away, and then you died. During its deadliest years, tuberculosis killed 1 person every 15 seconds. Entire families were wiped out, city morgues overflowed, and just like COVID, people were afraid. They wore masks, they isolated. But back then, there was no vaccine, no live streams, no Zoom calls, no hope. All they had were open-air beds, desperate experiments, and the faith that maybe, somehow, something might work. It sounds impossible, but doctors once believed the only way to save your life was to crush your lung. This was called an artificial pneumothorax, one of the first real treatments for tuberculosis. Tuberculosis bacteria need oxygen to survive. So the idea was this: if they collapsed the infected lung and made it stop working, the bacteria would die. Here's how it worked. A doctor would insert a long, hollow needle between your ribs and slowly inject air into the space around your lung. Not into your lungs, but around them. That air would push on your lung from the outside, crushing it until it shrank and collapsed. They hoped that by collapsing the lung, it would rest, that the infection would stop spreading, that the body would heal. Sometimes it worked. The fever stopped, the coughing slowed, the patient bought more time. But there was a catch. It didn't last. The lung would slowly expand again. So every few weeks, patients had to come back to get more air pumped in. Again and again. Some patients went through this for months, some for years. And it wasn't safe. Some patients developed internal bleeding, others got incorporates. A few had both lungs collapsed and never recovered. But they still lined up for it, because back then there were no antibiotics, no miracle pills. This was all they had. When your lungs are being destroyed, even a painful hope feels better than no hope at all. When collapsing the lung with air wasn't enough, doctors took it one step further. They started removing ribs, one by one. It was called thoracoplasty, a brutal surgery that involved cutting open the back or side of your chest and taking out parts of your rib cage. Why? Because without the support of the ribs, the chest would cave in and force the lung to collapse permanently. Just like artificial pneumothorax, the goal was to rest the lung. But this time, it wasn't temporary. This was permanent collapse. The surgery could take hours. Sometimes patients had 5, 6, or even 8 ribs removed. It left the body disfigured. Breathing became harder. Some patients could no longer sit upright or lift their arms normally. Many got infections. Others bled out on the table. There were no antibiotics to prevent complications, just bandages, gauze, and luck. But people agreed to it Because back then, it was this, or death. For thousands of patients, thoracoplasty was the last chance, the last desperate attempt to stay alive, even if it meant losing part of themselves in the process. Sleeping in the snow, the cold air cure. They called it treatment, but it looked like punishment. For much of the 19th and early 20th century, tuberculosis patients were sent away to the mountains, the forests, the cold. These places were called sanatoriums, quiet hospitals built far from cities where the air was clean and time moved slowly. Patients were told to rest, no talking, no reading, no visitors, just hours of silence and hope. Even in winter, beds were rolled onto open balconies. Patients were made to sleep outside, believing fresh air could cure their damaged lungs. Sometimes it worked, but only if the TB hadn't spread too far. But for thousands, the sanatorium was the last stop. In the worst years, some facilities reported 5, 10, even 12 deaths a day, one after another, mostly at night. Bodies were often removed quietly before sunrise so other patients wouldn't see the death. They called it the night cart. No sirens, no announcements, just the slow turning of wheels, and the hope that yours wouldn't be next. There were no antibiotics, no oxygen machines, no real way to stop the bleeding once it began. Just rest, air, and silence. Still, they believed. Because when there's no medicine, belief is all you have. Heliotherapy, when sunlight became the medicine. Long before anyone knew what vitamins were, doctors believed sunlight could save lives. They called it heliotherapy, the practice of exposing tuberculosis patients to direct sunlight every single day. Doctors thought that sunlight could kill the bacteria living in the lungs, or at least strengthen the body's immune system. Even before antibiotics, there were reports that fresh air and sun helped patients breathe better, sleep better, and sometimes recover. So patients were placed on outdoor beds or balconies, covered only with sheets, even in freezing temperatures. Some were exposed for up to 6 hours a day. Many were stripped to their waists, sometimes completely naked, to let the sunlight reach their chest and back. It wasn't glamorous. The light was blinding. The cold air was painful. But doctors believed the sun itself was the cure. It wasn't all wrong. Later, scientists discovered that sunlight helps produce vitamin D, a vital part of immune health. But heliotherapy was not a miracle. It didn't kill TB, and for patients in the final stages, sunlight was just a warmth they could feel, not a cure they could keep. Still, in a world without medicine, the sun gave people something else: hope, a reason to lie still, a reason to look up. Raw meat and blood when food became the last hope. When tuberculosis stripped the body down to bone, doctors turned to food as medicine. Not soups, not warm porridge, but raw meat, animal blood, bone marrow. In some sanatoriums, patients were prescribed diets of raw liver, cow's blood, and fresh goat's milk, often 3 to 5 times a day. The belief that these living foods could restore strength, build the immune system, and give the body one last chance to fight off the disease. Some families even took it further, slaughtering animals at home, collecting warm blood, and offering it to their sick loved ones, desperate to save them. None of it was based on science, but back then science didn't offer anything better. Doctors recommended pints of milk, raw eggs, fresh cream, and mutter-heavy meals, anything high in fat and protein. There were no antibiotics, no pills, just food, faith, and fear. And for the poor, even that was out of reach. Thousands died simply because they couldn't afford the calories to fight. Poison for a cure. What really happened to the patient? Tuberculosis destroyed your body slowly, but the cure sometimes destroyed you faster. Doctors didn't have antibiotics, so they reached for what they thought might work: poison, mercury, arsenic, opium. At first, the patient felt numb. The fever dropped, the cough softened, there was hope. But soon, the side effects began. Mercury made their teeth loosen, their skin blistered, some lost their hair, others lost their minds. Arsenic caused vomiting, diarrhea, extreme weakness. Fingers went numb, vision blurred, hands trembled constantly. And opium? At first it brought calm, peace, but then dependency, memory loss, hallucinations, and silence. They stopped coughing, but they also stopped eating, stopped recognizing their children, stopped speaking at all. Some patients survived longer, but most were just fading, dying slower. The doctors believed it helped. They saw the quiet and mistook it for healing. But the truth was, these poisons didn't kill the tuberculosis. They killed everything else. Still, patients kept drinking it because coughing blood felt worse than swallowing death. The cure that wasn't. Koch's tuberculin failure. For the first time, the world believed tuberculosis might finally be cured. The man behind it was a legend, Dr. Robert Koch, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who had already discovered the very bacteria that caused TB. In 1890, Koch stepped onto the world stage to announce his breakthrough, a new medicine called tuberculin. It wasn't a poison, it wasn't surgery, it was science. Tuberculin was made from crushed tuberculosis bacteria. The idea was to inject it into patients and train their immune system to recognize and destroy the disease. There was excitement, headlines, public demonstrations. For the first time, people started lining up for TB treatment, not to die, but to be saved. But it didn't last. Patients who took tuberculin began to react violently. Fevers spiked, some bled. Some slipped into comas, some died. Because tuberculin wasn't a cure. It didn't kill the bacteria, it only stimulated the immune response. And in patients already too sick, it made them worse. Koch was accused of hiding the side effects. Others said he moved too fast, that the hope of fame came before proof. And just like that, the miracle vanished. Tuberculin faded from hospitals, patients returned to the sanatoriums, and the world returned to silence. But the damage was done, not just in bodies, but in hearts. Because after tuberculin, people stopped believing in cures. What happened after the cure was found? For centuries, tuberculosis meant pain, slow death, desperate cures that did more harm than healing. In 1943, everything changed. With the discovery of streptomycin and later isoniazid and rifampin, for the first time in history, tuberculosis could be cured. Hospitals saw patients rise from their beds, sanatoriums emptied, doctors stopped injecting poison and started injecting real medicine. TB deaths dropped fast. What once killed 1 in 7 people was now treatable with a pill. The disease that had haunted human history, from pharaohs to poets, was finally under control. And just like that, the world moved on. We stopped fearing it. We stopped talking about it. We almost forgot it ever existed. But TB never left. Not completely. Not everywhere. Even today, tuberculosis still kills over 1 million people every year. Mostly the poor, mostly the forgotten. We cured the disease, but not the inequality behind it. The forgotten epidemic. Why tuberculosis still kills today. We found the cure, we had the drugs, but somehow, tuberculosis never really left. In rich countries, TB disappeared from the headlines. Sanatoriums were torn down. The story fell over. But in poor communities, in crowded cities, refugee camps, prisons, and slums, TB never stopped spreading. Today, over 10 million people get TB every year, and more than 1.3 million still die from it. Not because we don't have the medicine, but because millions still don't have access to it. Tuberculosis isn't just a disease of the lungs anymore. It's a disease of poverty, of broken systems, of being born in the wrong place. Even worse, drug-resistant TB is growing because when people stop taking antibiotics halfway, the bacteria fight back. They evolve. They return stronger. This time, antibiotics may not be enough. The battle we thought we won is still being fought every day. We can't wait for the world to remember, Because while TB doesn't make the news, it still takes a life every 22 seconds.